Hello and welcome to IAB UK's Podcast Upfront. I'm James Chandler, Chief Marketing Officer here at the IAB, streaming live from our central London HQ. It's Thursday, the 8th of October. It's about 2 minutes past 2 o'clock, and technically we should have all been huddled into Shoreditch Town Hall this afternoon. It just wasn't meant to be this year. Over 1,000 of you have signed up for our specialist upfronts across the last 2 days, so gaming yesterday and podcast today. So whatever platform you're viewing this on, whether it's Twitch or Twitter, Facebook or YouTube, a very warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Last year was the very first time that we'd run this podcast format, and I was genuinely blown away by the content, by the talent, by the turnout. And with anything like that, it's always hard to imagine how you could go one better. But a year on, and what an incredible year it's been, I couldn't have been more wrong. Over the next 2.5 hours, what we've put together for you and these brilliant partners is something quite exceptional. We've got a smattering of regional accents, deep intellectual conversation that's worn ever so lightly, storytelling so emotive it will have you glued to your screens. We've got lols, we've got candour, we've got more podcast stats in the next 2.5 hours than Jessie Ware's mum has cooked hot dinners. And that's before we even get to the talent. But rather than me introduce who's coming up, why don't I let them?
Hello to everybody who's joining this virtual IAB podcast upfront.
I think there's also something really deep about audio.
You know, the power of the pod. It was kind of amazing.
We can just talk about whatever we want.
This is people who love language.
All of those things generate emotion.
It's kind of amazing how broad British podcasting is.
You get that freedom, you get that intimacy.
Connected to what really matters.
And it's that level of engagement, it's how they get involved. It's unbelievable.
So this afternoon, you are genuinely going to hear from the creme de la creme of British podcasting. That being Acast, Spotify, Audioboom, Bauer Media, DAX and Podfront. And to kick us off right from the top, it's over to Acast, introducing Lizzie and Georgie.
Hello, I'm Lizzie Pollett, Acast's VP of Brand. I'm here with Georgie Holt, our Managing Director for the UK.
Hello.
A little later, we're going to be hearing from some of the biggest podcasters in the UK. We have Chris and Rosie Ramsey from Shagged, Married, Annoyed, as well as Poppy and Rubina from Brown Girls Do It Too. Both podcasts actually recently cleaned up at the British Podcast Awards. And then you're also going to be hearing more about great shows we have coming up on Acast later this year. But first, Georgie and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Acast and how we are moving the industry forward. So Georgie, you joined Acast right at the start of lockdown. We've never actually been in an office together.
I have not been in the office with you yet, LP. This is the first time I've met you in person.
But what attracted you to podcasting and Acast specifically?
I mean, quite simply, Acast is the world's biggest podcasting company globally. So it was just such a thrill to join the business and an industry which is in such fast growth, and Acast really is at the vanguard of that. I'm also getting to work with some seriously talented people as well, who are working with and monetizing some of the biggest podcasts in the world that are on the Acast network, from incredible publishers like The Guardian, The FT, The Times and The Economist, and household names such as Chris and Rosie Ramsey, John Bishop, Catherine Ryan, Ramesh Ranganathan and Jessie Ware. The only way for brands to connect with these podcasts and the incredibly engaged audiences that listen to them every day is through the Acast marketplace, which allows brands to connect with all of these shows through direct and automated access. And we really are the home of podcast buying globally. What else is so important to me, and I know it's so important to you too, LP, is Acast's commitment to the open ecosystem.
Yeah, we often talk about part of our mission is helping as many storytellers as possible find as big an audience as possible. So, we are massive advocates at Acast of the open ecosystem, which means that, our podcasters can have their shows listened to on any platform or any app, but also for advertisers, it means they're getting access to our over 13,000 shows globally, and they can meet those audiences wherever they are listening to podcasts. So, yeah, it's incredibly important for us as well.
I mean, what word comes up when we're talking about podcasts all the time at Acast is the word community. And every single show of ours has an incredibly loyal community. And I think over the last few months, we've really come to understand what community means and why it's so important. And to feel part of one, wherever you are, even via your favourite podcast. And I think for brands too, to kind of understand that podcasts are an incredible way to reach communities, which is incredibly vital if you want to build a community around your own product, platform or narrative. Podcasts are such an effective and trusted space to do this. We see stats like 76% of people who listen to a podcast take action from the ads that they hear, which is just incredible. And to that end, we kind of think about our podcast as the best kind of influencers. They're trusted tastemakers with loyal fans, and aligning your brand with a podcast is literally the best word of mouth strategy you could get. There is nothing else that comes close.
Yeah, and you mentioned the pandemic there, of course, so it would be remiss of us not to just talk about, how we have found the last 6 months, has that affected us? What's it meant for podcasting?
I mean, podcasting has emerged as an even more vital medium, not just for audiences, but also for advertisers. And we've seen continued growth in both our effectiveness in ad campaigns and the audiences that come to podcasts every single day. And we've seen the biggest numbers of listens globally at Acast since the beginning of lockdown. We've actually seen a record number of listens in the UK. In July, we had 52 million listens alone in that month, which is just extraordinary. And it isn't just about the scale and it isn't about the effectiveness, it's also about the speed and flexibility of this medium too. We can also turn around campaigns in just 24 hours. So as brands are adjusting to the news landscape that's dominating our world right now and they need to tweak an ad message, they can absolutely do that with podcasts. I just don't think there's any other medium that comes close to that right now that can also deliver high trust and high reach.
Absolutely. And just looking forward as well, I think that's really important. Something I want to talk about is I feel so lucky to work in podcasting because it's such a vital platform to give a platform to underrepresented voices. And at Acast, so we have made lots of strides in this area. So last summer we launched A-Class, which is our series of masterclasses for underrepresented voices as well. We were really proud to sign the Equality in Audio Pact that's been set up by some of our partners in the industry this summer. It's so important. And then we're also currently working on a great programme looking at how we connect some of our biggest podcasts in the world with some of the other shows which deserve a much bigger audience in terms of promotional activity. So I'm really looking forward to what we've got coming up in the next sort of 6 months, I suppose, in that space.
And for us, in the advertising perspective, there are so many great things coming up. I've really only got time to talk about two. So I'm going to talk about two of the most important things coming up. One is keyword targeting. This is going to allow advertisers to identify keywords and phrases that are most important to their brand and be able to build a podcast campaign from that. So they're going to be using AI targeting to not only identify the word, but to also understand the sentiment that's being used around that topic so they're not aligning with anything negative. And it's going to be such a game changer to build contextual advertising campaigns within podcasts because we've seen stats like 42% higher engagement from contextual ads and up to twice the ad recall. So we're so excited that Acast is going to be bringing this to the industry. The other really cool thing we're doing right now is a virtual storefront on Acast, which is essentially building a completely self-serve planning, booking tool for advertisers and clients and agencies. And this is going to be allowing them to, first and foremost, the way we started it is to plan a campaign to access and take advantage of the thousands of shows that are currently on the Acast network. The next step of that is to actually not only plan the campaign, but reserve the ad slots, book the ad slots, upload the audio and set the campaign live. So it's going to be a really seamless automated experience for all of our advertisers and a real game changer.
We're not going to be bored. There is a lot going on. Oh, well, thank you so much, Georgie. It's been so lovely to talk about everything we've got going on. But next, you're going to hear from four of the biggest podcasters in the country. So we have Chris and Rosie Ramsey of Shagged, Married, Annoyed, and Poppy and Rubina from Brown Girls Do It Too. And as one of the biggest smars in the country, I'm delighted to say, take it away, Chris.
Thank you, Lizzie. Yes, I am Chris Ramsey from Shagged, Married, Annoyed, and it is lovely to be here with our wonderful friends at Acast, with my wife Rosie from Shagged, Married, Annoyed, with Poppy and Rubina from Brown Girls Do It Too, to discuss why podcasts are just so brilliant. That's why we're here.
I can't wait. I'm so excited.
So obviously, Rosie, you are my wife. From Shagged, Married, Annoyed. Say
for
hello.
my sins, yes.
For my sins?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Wow, straight in there. And we have Poppy and Rubina from the award-winning...
Woo! Oh my God, I didn't get the award. Why didn't I get the award?
For the people who haven't listened to our podcast yet, would you like to tell people a little bit about what you're... I mean, it's Brown Girls Do It Too. I think we've all got an idea. But would you like to give a little summarise of what's...
Sure. So it's a 6-part podcast series about the wonderful thing that is sex. I know.
My God!
But I guess we use it as a prism to talk about all sorts of things like race and class and gender.
Yeah.
But it's really about like dirty sex and how sex can sometimes be unsexy and hairy and disgusting. And
We're not sexperts at any point. In fact, every third episode there's a disclaimer saying, "Don't try this at home." Don't try this at home.
Yeah.
And it's I listen back to it and it sound like I'm sort of taken back to like 3 16-year-olds having a little giggle.
Yeah.
And being funny, and I don't think that we are worthy or preachy, but and also when you look at the best sex and relationship category, there's loads of podcasts in the sex and relationship genre. I don't think ours was innovative in that sense, but I think in our community, because we don't talk about sex at all. I know no one talks about sex, but we really don't talk about it, and we're almost ashamed of it. To do it, I think, in the way that we did. I mean, there were moments where Rubina was like, "I can't say this," and I'm like, "Say it."
You very much sound like the instigator for a lot of the podcast.
There were definitely moments where, because I think the listeners were finding out our sex stories as we were discovering things about ourselves. So, in that sense, it was. It was real magic in the studio. And also we thought 6 people would listen to it, we'd put it on our CV, say we'd done a podcast, cool, move on.
The same.
Yeah.
We thought the same.
Really?
Just weren't prepared for the power of podcasts at all.
No, we had no idea. We started out, it was very much like, let's just try this. And we naively said, let's try this because I don't think many people listen to podcasts.
We were so naive about it, yeah.
Little did we
Really
know.
were. Acast like to use the word community when talking about podcasts. I'd prefer cult with ours. Ours are, they're intense, they're amazing. But yeah, they're out there. So we all did well at the British Podcast Awards. You guys won best sex and relationships?
Sex and relationship,
Best sex and relationships. And then didn't you win an overall award?
We won the best overall podcast.
Best overall podcast. Best
That's
podcast.
unbelievable.
Take the word overall out of there. That's best
That's
podcast.
what I said. You've changed
Best
that
podcast.
twice now. It's best. You've got the best.
You've
podcast.
added like a modesty word into there.
Yeah.
Overall, best
Overall,
podcast.
it was okay. Fine.
And we won listener's choice because, like you said, we now lead a cult. Weirdly, a fact here: Acast podcast scooped 15 of the 25 gold awards, which is amazing. What are your thoughts on British podcasting and the stories people are telling out there? What other things are you listening to and enjoying, really?
It's kind of amazing how broad British podcasting is and all the kind of niche storytelling that can happen. You've got like table manners or Homo sapiens or receipts. It's like people are really like tapping into their like niche communities and able just to talk.
Or cults, niche cults.
Yeah. And once you've got your following, it's just amazing how deep you can go into it because you can sit there and just like get to know these people for a really long period of time. I think there's like the British podcasting scene has like recently exploded in a way that like we're catching up with the Americans at like a really fast speed.
I agree.
And I also think podcasts give different cults and communities opportunities in a way I don't think TV did really. I mean, you have I May Destroy You, but in terms of like sharing the narrative and the alternative perspective, I just don't think TV takes as many risks. So podcast definitely gives a platform for everyone to have their own cult, and you can tap into those communities and you can go deep and you can touch, it can be superficial. I think there's much more scope as well.
Yeah, you can get away with a lot more as well,
Yeah,
can't
you can, yeah.
No, well, I worked in radio before we did the podcast, and when we did the podcast, I loved it, didn't I? I was like, we can just talk about whatever we want, and there's no rules, and it's just, and personally, that's why I listen to podcasts, because you
Don't talk about that. And then one time you talked about what was when you get someone on the back of your bike when you're a kid and someone sits on the seat and you pedal.
Yeah.
We call that a backer.
Backer.
Right?
A backer.
What do you call that?
See,
Backseat.
the regional
Backseat.
yeah.
We need to start putting a bit of
So-
Geordie in it.
One time on the radio, Rosie and our co-host put that out and it like went huge.
Yeah.
But the radio, the bosses were like, you don't talk about stuff like that. And we sat down and realised within the first couple of episodes of our podcast, all the stuff we were talking about that the listeners were really engaging with and emailing in was all the stuff the radio had told her not to talk about. And it was like, don't talk about mundane things. People want to know, like, you know what I mean, the ins and outs of stuff, like what people wouldn't. I mean, you definitely couldn't talk about what you guys talk about on radio.
but sex isn't talked about a lot.
Yeah.
No, you're right.
And it's so
there's similarities between our podcasts. I mean, ours is more horror stories.
Yeah.
And they're not ours, thank God.
But I love how you take the mundane and the sort of everyday activities of life or conversations, and you two are absolute who. I'd be like, definitely want to have a drink with them in the pub.
Oh, everyone
hilarious.
says that. We're actually very boring in
Very
real life.
boring.
Very
We are
boring.
so boring in real life, but for that hour, Now we're at the kitchen table. We are superstars.
Cool dudes.
It's the engagement, and it's so I've done stand-up for years, and I've done TV shows, and the rule seems to always be that producers always put across is, and this is a sweeping generalisation, but they always say that you can't really rely on the audience to give you too much stuff. It's like you need to have stuff prepared. You can't rely on the audience to give you great content. Our emails. We've got 20,000 emails sitting in our inbox, just all stories from the public. And it's that level of engagement. It's how they get involved. Yeah. It's unbelievable.
It's great. What was your reaction from the public? Well, how did you find it within your community as well? Did you find it really, really good?
Well, it was definitely mixed.
Yeah.
Like, you know,
really?
not many brown women go on air to talk about anything, and when they do, they get a lot of disses. I mean, if you're a woman on the internet in general, you kind of get trolled.
Yeah,
to shit.
knackered. Yeah.
So we had a lot of that to kick off with, and then we had like loads of creepy guys being like, "Hey,
What is your name?" And I'm like, piss off. Are you fit though? I'm joking. So we did get our first
Can I just say I'm still really annoyed you told me to piss off when I sent you that.
I think also this is something that we've said this in our interviews, like I really do feel like the stakes were a bit higher for us in terms of family and pressure and reputation.
Yeah.
I mean, they're fine now, they're talking to me now. But there's 6 of them and we're in a WhatsApp. Can you imagine, like, by the way, I'm doing a sex podcast. So I wanted to speak to them one-on-one individually, give them time. You know, they were like, they've been
we also had like this incredible wave of other people who were
That's
like,
what we're more interested in.
yeah, and we're like everyone fucking hated us, but no, that's not what happened. Like we had
But I think it's what you're doing is really important.
Yeah.
Because there'll be so many women and men who will be listening, and they'll be like, "Oh gosh, we can talk about this, and it's okay." And yeah, I think it's great.
Yeah, we had loads of nice, like, young women, men contacting us, people in America, people, like, all across
What's
the UK
the one that you got
contacting us.
from the Mauritius person?
Someone was like, I'm going to send this to my suppressed cousins in Mauritius so they can, like, get on board. People just, like, are sharing it, like, really rapidly. Actually, the word of mouth for our podcast is probably, like, the thing that took it.
Because it's on someone's phone, it's on their device, it's straight into their ears. And that's the thing with doing stand-up and telly for years. You don't build the same kind of audience that you do with a podcast. It's blown my mind.
So we've recently started doing ads with Acast on our podcast, and so far they've gone down really, really well.
Yeah.
We're really enjoying it because it kind of, you can put a little bit extra of the podcast into an ad without making it sound like an ad, because it's Chris and I's voices usually, instead of, you know, somebody who people don't know.
Like that guy, the fast-talking guy coming in with all the terms and conditions apply. Like, you don't need him. Like,
We
you
had
can
to
do
do
it
that
yourself.
on one of them, and you were
I did
very
get to
excited.
do one. I was very excited. I had to say terms and conditions apply, and I did it really quick. That was a bucket list check off for me.
But we've advertised some amazing brands. One thing I really liked as well from ads, because some people do not like adverts, and that's fine. It's part and parcel of it. And I listen to loads of podcasts with adverts in. But I actually, the first time since we started doing ads on the podcast, I get tweets of people who have listened to the ad and bought the thing that we've been advertising.
Success. That's what they want.
But I've never known that. I've never ever experienced that until we started doing them on the podcast. And I'm like, oh, people listen to that bit and they've bought it, or they've used a discount code, or they've done like a swipe.
Well, in the past,
or
I've
something.
bought loads of stuff from podcasts I've listened to. So then when we started doing it, I thought, well, that just makes sense, yeah.
And it feels really honest, doesn't it? Like, you're telling your listeners, hey, we are using ads. It feels really, like, straight and fresh.
Yeah.
And as it's our show, we choose. You get a choice of what you want to advertise and what you don't want to advertise. So most podcasts, I think, it's a genuine thing that the podcasters will use.
Because it is such a community cult with your audience, you don't want to sort of sell anything to them that you wouldn't have yourself, or advertise anything to them, or kind of cheat them or dupe them in any way. You want to go, this is a good thing, this would be good for you if you like the stuff we like, kind of thing. Guys, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much indeed. Hand it over to Christiana from Acast.
Thank you so much, Chris, Rosie, Poppy and Rubina. We're so incredibly grateful to have you here with us today. But now, in our last section for today, Leo and I are going to take you through a whistle-stop tour of some of our great new shows in 2020 and beyond. Leo, always such an ambitious task in less than 5 minutes, so let's get straight into it. What's new in the wonderful world of podcasting?
Well, Christiana, thank you. It's no secret that some of the biggest podcasts in the world follow an interview format. So I'm incredibly excited to say that the king of the interview, Jeremy Paxman himself, is starting a podcast with Acast.
And, of course, we also have Patricia Bright joining us for the second season of a really unique finance and personal development podcast, Caught Off Guard. Now, Patricia is such a huge influencer for us. and is another example of this really, really exciting trend we're seeing of more influencers flocking to the podcasting space and bringing with them their engaged community of listeners.
Absolutely, and we're seeing that in the comedy space as well, with John Bishop, one of Britain's biggest stand-up comedians, starting a new show. We've also got the Joe Marler Show. Joe is such a big sports personality, and I've listened to a few of the clips of this podcast. I urge you all to tune in when it releases soon, because it sounds like it's going to be so funny.
I couldn't agree more. And both these shows join us from the brand new Manchester Crowd Network. And we were lucky enough to meet this team a couple of weeks ago, and they are so incredibly passionate about creating great content. And they bring with it a really interesting new slate of really popular US formats into the UK. So I do highly recommend people trial that along at home.
Yeah, it's absolutely brilliant to see this regional diversity coming through with more producers based outside of London. And to go with that, we've got Open Goal as well, joining Acast, the biggest sports podcast in Scotland with 120,000 listens each week. We've also got Melissa Reddy's new show. Let me tell you how excited I am about this. She is the most exciting young sports journalist in England, full stop. And she's launching a new show called Between the Lines, which is coming out soon.
I've been lucky enough to hear a few early snippets of this one, actually, and I think that Melissa may even give the Ramble Boys a run for their money.
It's funny you should say that. She's actually joining as part of their network and becoming a regular pundit on the Football Ramble Daily, which is brilliant news for them and for her. And it's so great to see our podcasters collaborate in this way.
Of course, I always welcome more female voices into the podcasting sporting genre as well. And now we've been lucky enough to feature them here today. But of course, this year we also welcome with very wide open, warm arms, Chris and Rosie Ramsey from Shag, Married, Annoyed. A show so big, so entertaining that we were lucky enough to welcome a brand new advertiser, one of the most premium global brands in the world in Apple TV+. And this complements, of course, Catherine Ryan, a very, very familiar face to us. But we welcomed her new podcast, Telling Everyone Everything. These two titles, of course, just complement our existing slate of huge, giant comedic shows and really do help to reaffirm our position, Leo, as the home of UK British podcasting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's easy to forget that My Dad Wrote a Porno, the smash hit comedy show, started in a pub with just Jamie reading his dad's book. So there's very low barrier to entry in podcasting, which is what makes it such a great medium. What else have we got that bolsters representation?
It's such an interesting point, and certainly one that Georgine LP nodded to earlier, but our commitment to diversity and bringing the whole entire industry forward in this space, particularly supporting diverse creators who are so incredibly vital to the podcast ecosystem. And with that, this year we are incredibly proud to welcome the Pink Protest Network by author, influencer and activist Scarlett Curtis. It's a breakthrough network bringing together really exciting titles like Feminists Don't Wear Pink, The Body Protest, football, feminism and everything in between, bringing up us. And this also complements a series of other independents like Amalia, the UK's foremost online publication for and by Muslim women, Black Ballad, the platform for stories through the eyes of Black British women, Growing Up with Galdem, of course, the breakthrough publication for women and non-binary people of colour, and finally on Things We Left Behind, of course, Acast's very own LaunchPod competition winners exploring the hidden afterlife after war. I, for one, Leo, am very, very excited to listen and learn from these exciting new titles.
And of course, it would be remiss of us to sit here and talk about content without talking about the big five publishers in the UK, The Guardian, The Economist, The FT, The Times and the BBC. These guys together produce over 1,000 podcasts, which is absolutely incredible in terms of scale. And they're continuing to invest and develop the space. And in 2018, The Guardian started Today in Focus, which was the first of a journalistic daily update format podcast. Since then, we've seen the FT News Briefing. We've seen Stories of Our Times by The Times. We've seen The Intelligence by The Economist. They continue to push the medium forward with Wireless Studio producing The Times Briefing and TalkSport Hit, two more daily format shows. What's so exciting is to see other genres adopt and push this forward as well. We now have Daily History from Dan Snow's History Hit. We've got Daily Football from the Football Ramble Daily. We've got Daily Politics from The Bunker. We've got Daily Quizzes from Quiz Chat Repeat coming out soon. We've even got Daily Poetry and Comedy from the Rob Orton Daily, which recently picked up a gold in the British Podcast Awards. So what's really exciting is seeing this development occur firsthand and giving brands more opportunity and seeing the whole medium push itself forward and become more dynamic.
More content, more genres, more often. I'm certainly not going to argue with that. Feels like a perfect place to, unfortunately, close our session at the IAB Upfronts. As you can see, there's so much opportunity available in the world of content. And for us, and thanks to our incredible Acast creative team, content is really just the beginning. It's the evolution of our brand partnerships and the creativity we've seen evolve across the past 12 months. Particularly sponsor reads and now 3D immersive audio ad formats, social, long-form branded content. It's these integration opportunities that, as you know, personally excite me each and every day. So if you feel inspired, please do reach out to your local Acast rep or contact the Acast UK sales team. Believe the emails on your screen. Or why not browse our new storefront for the Acast Marketplace, where you can browse all of our many thousands and thousands of titles online right now. Again, I believe the URL is on your screen. Well, thank you so much, Leo, and thank you to all of our contributors and, of course, the IAB. Certainly hope that next year we're doing this in the flesh. Take care.
That was brilliant. There was just so much stuff in there to unpack. Georgie was talking about the two things that are coming up from Acast. You've got keyword targeting, and of course you've got their virtual storefront as well, self-serve planning and booking tool. I loved Poppy from Poppy and Rubina, who was saying, like, we think we're going to get 6 listens fast forward, and they're like winning best podcast at the British Podcasting Awards, which is incredible. And Chris talking about the level of engagement they get with their pod. He says we've got like 20,000 emails in an inbox. He doesn't quite get that from stand-up that he's done. He was on the One show last week. And if you listen to their podcast, I was listening in the car the other day, they're on like 80-something episodes. It's still as fresh as anything. And like, they're married, they like live together, getting on with their lives, but they could still make this incredible content for every episode. Brilliant, brilliant stuff. What a way to start. We move on now, and this presentation might quite be the most meta thing you're seeing with any sort of virtual event at the moment. He's more typically known for his incredible prowess on the physical stage, particularly when he's on the IAB stage, of course, but nothing is lost, believe you me, in digital form. So up next from Spotify with a very, very special guest, it's Rak Patel.
Welcome everyone to Spotify's IAB Podcast Upfront, and I'm delighted that we are here, brought to you via a vodcast, which is a member of the podcast family tree. I'm Rak Patel, and I'm Head of Sales for UK and Panamea at Spotify. And over the space of the next 20 to 25 minutes, we are going to explore all things love audio, digital audio, and of course, really focusing on podcasts and how they've had a meteoric rise from niche to what they are now, such a companion to all consumers. Now, for those of you that have tuned in via the vodcast, you will see that I am in what I think is a pretty sensational Hawaiian shirt, and that is in homage to our brilliant guest that we have today. So he is not only one of, if not the most influential people within the advertising industry, he is a podcast host himself. I'm delighted to say that we have Rory Sutherland with us today. Now, Rory is Vice Chairman, as you all know. He needs no introduction, but he's Vice Chairman of Ogilvy UK and an expert on consumer behaviour, trends and the influence of the internet. Before founding Ogilvy's behavioural science practice, Rory was a copywriter and creative director at Ogilvy for over 20 years, having joined them as a graduate in 1988. He has been president of the IPA, chair of the judges for the direct jury at Cannes, and has spoken at TED Global. It doesn't stop there. He writes regular columns for The Spectator, Market Leader and Impact, and also occasional pieces for Wired. He's the author of 2 quite brilliant books, The Wikiman, available on Amazon at prices between £1.94 and £2,345.54, dependent upon whether the algorithm is having a bad day or good day, dependent upon your perspective, and the best-selling Alchemy, The Surprising Power of Ideas Which Don't Make Sense. Welcome, Rory.
Oh, it's a huge pleasure to be on. I'm delighted. Thank you.
Great to have you here. And I've got to start with this Hawaiian shirt. I mean, you know, what do you think? Is this okay? Is it to your is it near your standard?
It's pretty fine. It's less necessary for you than it is for me. And there's a very simple reason for this, which is I think the Hawaiian shirt encapsulates a brilliant bit of behavioral psychology, which is it's the psychological solution to the obesity crisis. Because it's a very strange item of clothing in the sense that the bigger you are, the better they look. So if you think about it, you've got to have at least a reasonable level of rotundity to carry off. Tom Selleck or up. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, look, no doubt I'll need to be wearing these sort of Hawaiian shirts as the years start to stack up. So look, I want to start with, the obviously quite crazy last 6 months that we've had and the change that it's had on, all our behaviours and in particular working life. How's your working life changed? Are you finding that you're much more efficient? Are you yearning for human interaction or are you missing the odd, global conference stage, Rory?
I think, no, funnily enough, I don't miss the travel at all. I don't miss the commuting at all. I think I've been more productive and I think I've generally had a better quality of life at the same time. One of my clients, in fact, said that he'd worked harder, produced better work per hour and had a happier time. So there was no way he was going back to the status quo ante. I think there's something very interesting about the whole thing, actually, which is that a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, all of us believed that we ourselves could, of course, work remotely and at home because we were trustworthy and highly committed people, but we never believed that everybody else could do it. And it took a kind of enforced experiment like this to discover that, in fact, what works individually also works at scale. And I think nobody suspected it beforehand. A lot of people aren't. Number of businesses which basically say, at the very least, we're going to be 3-2 in perpetuity, 3 days working at home, 2 in the office. And that's not just kind of weird ad agencies or tech firms, which tend to be quite experimental or like to show off about how open-minded they are. These are really boring banks are doing the same thing as well.
Rory, you mentioned about the conversation with your clients. So tell the audience that's listening, just in terms of how's that conversation evolved over the last 6 months or so? What are you seeing, across the board and maybe in pockets as well?
Well, I see vindicated a little bit of what I used to say. One of them is that the problem with big data is it all comes from the same place, the past. And you can have accumulated a huge amount of data and information on listening habits, viewing habits, and everything else. And then one major event changes everything. And I think will change it a large part in perpetuity, by the way. Shopping habits will change, travel habits, business travel habits will change immensely, I think. And so one of the other things I think it demonstrates is that perhaps marketing is economically much more important than we think. And I think what it demonstrates is that the very fact that you can have a technology like Zoom, which suddenly gets adopted and sticks, suggests that in many cases, the big obstacles to progress, economic, environmental, technological progress, are psychological obstacles in the level of consumer behavior. They're not the old-fashioned economic constraints of supply and distribution. And I think we've had a bit of a kind of crash course in understanding that more and more business questions are really behavioral questions, they're marketing questions, and that business's traditional focus on kind of tedious cost-cutting and efficiency drives only takes you so far.
And so how's that sort of evolved, particularly over the last 5 to 10 years, as clearly audio and audio advertising, we're sat here at a podcast Upfront that's been run by the IAB. I mean, how have attitudes changed, would you say, and are they changing for the better?
Well, first of all, we've got to look at how people are listening differently now, because obviously drive time probably isn't what it was. The fact that, of course, that these are now streamed rather than downloaded gives you an extra level of measurement. The fact that you have these large networks, including Spotify, means that actually, although this is a long tail, in other words, there are a hell of a lot of podcasts with relatively few listeners. When you aggregate the whole thing, you have a pretty good mass audience. Nonetheless, that's another really important thing, looking at how I've always said that radio, a bit like cigarettes and coffee, is the natural entertainment of the productive. Because, whatever you think about smoking or drinking coffee or listening to the radio, it's the thing that hardworking people do, because you can do it at the same time as doing something useful. You can't get pissed out of your head, and you can't watch television while doing useful work. But you'll notice that carpenters, builders, but equally working from home business people are going to have audio on in the background. Because it's the natural mode of hardworking people is to have something which entertains you and distracts you without preventing you from getting on with something useful.
Exactly.
really valuable there. There's also something, by the way, I'd love to delve into this. I think there's also something really deep about audio. So I was a classicist at university, and I remember reading Homer, which is, okay, in the original Greek, right? But I mean, it was written, nobody's quite sure, 600 BC, 700 BC. And there's this strange single passage in Homer, which they're not even sure is genuine, in which someone sends someone a block of stone on which were engraved strange signs. And we all thought this was pretty weird when we were reading this. They said, you realize, well, this is really significant. It's pretty much the first ever literary reference to writing. What? Mm-hmm. So writing is like 2,500 years old. In evolutionary time, it's a blip, okay? It's a flicker at the very end of evolutionary time. Whereas speech and listening to speech and stories and storytelling, they're about, well, let's take a guess, 250,000 years old, okay? So the way in which speech gets into your head, and the speed, by the way, of transmission, is just more effortless than reading, but it also perhaps taps into parts of the brain which print can't reach. And so that really fascinates me, the fact that there's something kind of magical about radio, because it's a far more ancient, okay, it's an older medium than TV by 20 years. But on the other hand, the kind of information it carries, if I can get a bit Marshall McLuhan, that's age-old form of storytelling versus the comparatively newfangled idea of text, which is practically the internet in evolutionary history. It's that recent.
And on that as well, because something our founder and CEO Daniel talked about maybe a few years ago or so was, why are eyes 10 times more worthy than the ears? And obviously that's been a strategy at Spotify in terms of owning the ear and so on. So that really plays into that. And do you actually see that value of the ear has changed and evolving as in relation to what you sort of touched on there?
Well, there's another thing which also applies to vodcasting as well, by the way, which is a product of COVID, which we shouldn't forget. And I call this thing Sutherland's law, slightly egotistically, which is my general...
How many is there? How many laws have you got?
Well, it was, funny enough, a TV programme featuring Ian Cuthbertson in the 1970s, but no one in WPP will remember that, of course, because they're all under 30. Oops, didn't say that. But the interesting thing with Sutherland's law is that my contention is that practically everybody on the planet, apart from David Beckham and Bill Clinton, will give you an hour of their time on Zoom or on a podcast for somewhere between $0 and $1,000, maybe pounds, if you're getting really generous, okay? But there are not many people on the planet who, if you said, tell you what, I'd like an hour of your time virtually, in other words, a virtual hour of your time, I don't have to fly to Amsterdam, I don't have to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, there's no big opportunity cost, it doesn't prevent me going on holiday that week, okay? I can do that damn thing from Barbados if I want to, not that I'll be going to Barbados for about 5 years, but on principle I could, okay? And so the fact that you can get really, really interesting people to talk to you really, really easily, I'm pretty confident Nobel Prize winners, now this is, by the way, particularly interesting for B2B, because if you think about it, we should give a lot of thought about podcasting and B2B, because in B2B, the principal mode of communication was F to F. It was face to face. And that's not going to be happening anymore. I mean, no one's going to want to have a conference, a trade fair, a trade exhibition, and risk having their brand attached to a super spreading event. Okay, it's too big a risk. It's too big a reputational risk. And so a huge amount of B2B, everything from small-scale business meetings to large-scale conferences and events, is going to have to be reinvented digitally in some form over the next year and a half.
Of course.
And that fascinates the hell out of me, because the possibility to take business conversation out of the boardroom and onto the airwaves, as it were, is really, really interesting.
Yeah.
So I've just started talking to an organization called Speakers for Schools. And I said, why don't you create a little extension called Conferences for Schools? And if there's a business conference on something quite interesting, just allow kids to attend for free. Maybe only 20 of them will, but that's 20 people who never realized that there was a career in kind of aircraft interior design or something like that. So this possibility to take things out of the face-to-face arena which was heavily weighted towards senior people who probably didn't need to be there, and where most of the money went on accommodation and transportation. Suddenly this can be redirected to content instead. And, you know, as I said, if you asked me, it would take me a couple of days, but I could get a Nobel Prize winner on a podcast, you know, if you gave me a budget of 500 quid and 2 days of my time. That's magical. Fantastic.
Of course it is, and incredibly fascinating, and really sort of, you know, that's only the tip of the iceberg. What, you know, that's clearly one reason why, you know, your On Brand podcast is sensational. It's the Bible of podcasts within the advertising industry. Now, you know,
really one of many. It's part of the ecosystem.
Of course. What drew you to it? What, you know, there you talked about one scope, which is around, you know, the types of guests you could potentially go on. What drew you to, you know, to podcasts as a medium?
The very fact that I could do it from anywhere. You know, I tend to work from home on Fridays. They tend to be recorded on Fridays. It is extraordinarily pleasurable. I get to meet some really, really interesting people. Other people seem to really enjoy the conversations. I learn as much as I contribute from each of the interviews. Altogether, it's just a fantastic pleasure to do.
Great. Where's it going? Where do you see it going? We had a fascinating conversation about this, didn't we? About long form and short form and so on. I'd love you to share that with the audience today.
There's an enhancement I'd like, and I tried to get Spotify to do this a few years ago, and they didn't. And I wanted the link with Waze so that you could pod your journey. So if my sat nav, i.e. Waze, told me my journey was going to take an hour and 30 minutes, it would provide me with an hour and 15 minutes worth of podcast. I left the 15 minutes at the end of the journey silent because that's when your sat nav's telling you turn left, turn right, don't go there, go straight on. But for the bulk of the journey where you're just ploughing down a motorway, if you could have a thing that compiled podcasts in a way that was suited to your particular time frame, that would be a real bonus for me. And I think that's just one behavioral enhancement you could add to podcasting software. Yeah, you know, sometimes I want 30 minutes. I'm going to go. I'm a massive fan of True Life Crime Case File, for example. There's a great British one, All Killer No Filler, which is two female Mancunian comedians talking about serial killers, which I don't think anybody would have taken that to the commissioning editor of Four, would they really? Yeah, we're going to do a comedy program about Ed Gein, you know, okay.
Yeah.
Dennis Nielsen, let's find the comedy potential in that. And you also get wonderful things, Beef and Dairy Network, which is so surreal and brilliant. I don't know if you're familiar with it. But it's a comedy podcast which pretends to be a deadly serious specialist business podcast on beef and dairy farming, while basically incorporating elements of the completely surreal and the ridiculous.
And
it's particularly clever. But that's what I love, is the low-cost ingenuity here. And comedians tell me, because I hang out with them occasionally when I can, they always tell me they're really grateful, because Radio 4 kind of was a bit of a, you know, getting into Radio 4 comedy was a lot harder than becoming a made man in the Gambino family. You know, it was really difficult to break into. And now they said the great thing about podcasting is we have this whole experimental space.
Absolutely.
Which is really, really tremendous.
Yeah. And we see it on our platform.
Yeah. It's brilliantly Darwinian. And you'll see things which suddenly come from nowhere and break through.
Oh, totally right. And true crime as well is one of our outstanding genres. It really is. 70% of all true crime listeners are female as well. So,
This
it's
is
fascinating,
alarming, isn't it?
And my wife loves them as well. So there we go. You know, but you did reference there just in terms of the commute and so on, and actually something to, you know, do watch his space. We've actually launched something in the US for a little while called Your Daily Drive, which does exactly that. It's a combination of podcasts, so you know the spoken word with your favorite music as well. So that's something that, you know, hopefully you'll hear more on as we end the year. Now, you know, obviously the folk that we have on the vodcast are marketing and advertising professionals. What you know, they're talking to brands all the time or are from brands. What should brands be thinking about when thinking about the podcast space, audio space? You know, what are the sort of things that you think should be sort of top of mind?
One of the things would be just use this to be more experimental, okay? And the same applies to all digital media. There's a bit of a tragedy in marketing, which is that we tend to get siloed. So you get a digital guy and you might even get a radio guy and you get a TV guy. And the problem is the metrics in those silos are all the same metrics. And they tend to be optimization metrics where you can't afford to experiment because your best approach is always incremental improvement and, efficiency gains. And my argument is those fast fail media like digital, programmatic, and radio, they should actually have about 50% of their budget should be experimental. Because I always love this phrase, I learned it from Matt Ridley, which is biology is the science of exceptions. And I think marketing is really the science of exceptions. We've got it wrong. We're trying to develop these universal rules for marketing, which are universally true, like Newtonian physics, and they don't exist. What you need to do is take a Darwinian mindset and wander around the Galapagos Islands until you discover something that's really unusual or unexpected, and try and then understand what's happening there. And so that's what really interests me, is that the experimentation point is that in those media where you can kill your failures really fast, what you should be looking for, again, this is what worries me about people introducing AI and all this data stuff, is it's great, but most of the people are using the wrong maths. Okay, they're fundamentally using the wrong statistical models to try and understand what's going on. And you can be hugely confident and massively wrong at the same time if you do that. If you use the wrong maths, essentially, to analyze data, you can have complete confidence in what the model's telling you while basically being utterly wrong because of some rogue confounding variable or whatever. And so the vital thing, I think, is that these media which are less expensive should receive more attention because they should be the experimental space. I mean, I'll give you an example from the behavioral science practice. How do you sell dollar fries for KFC in Australia? Well, it turned out after a ton of experimentation, the most powerful line to sell dollar fries is maximum 4 per customer. Now, it was buried in the legal lines before. It was written by a lawyer, and someone just decided, well, scarcity bias. People actually are compelled to buy things if they feel there's a limitation on them. And sure enough, not only did the volume of fries go up massively, but the number of people buying 4 also went up massively.
Brilliant.
And that's one of those things where you won't discover it through logic. There isn't any data that'll tell you that. That's the kind of area where you need to be using these niche forms of communication to make your next breakthrough. That's my view.
Yeah, got it. I've got one final question, actually, and that's very much centered, again, something that I know both of us have discussed in the past. So digital audio in particular, we've seen real fast strides and evolution over the space of the last 18 months, and clearly the last 6 months have really sort of propagated the consumption of digital audio. Do you see similarities with digital video and what video went through, say, 15, 10 odd years ago or so?
Yeah, they're kind of intertwined. And by the way, the vodcast, I think, will grow quite often. I mean, the video is kind of optional. I mean, that's an interesting question about online business conferences, because when I speak at a conference or attend a conference online, for about a third of the day it's television and 2/3 of the day it's radio. So I get on with some emails and things and listen in the background and, look up when it's necessary. Yeah. And so understanding that, and actually the fact that they're quite close in certain forms, they're actually quite closely intertwined, I think is really interesting. I also can see a really interesting thing, which is that among business people, the old-fashioned status moniker or marker of the BA Gold Executive Club or the Virgin, whatever it is, Flying Club Gold Card, will be replaced by incredibly elaborate recording and filming equipment. In 2 years' time, I won't travel anywhere at all, but I'll have some sort of weird Leica video conferencing.
Yeah, absolutely. Your own little studio.
With 3 cardioid microphones hanging in front of me instead. That'll turn really interesting as well, I think.
On that note, and what a lovely image to leave us with, to finish this brilliant interview. Rory, you've been absolutely fantastic, as we knew you were going to be. Thank you so much. As always, sharing some brilliant insights for the audience today.
Look, more power to your elbow. Anything I can do to support this medium is great with me, because I love it as an advertiser, but I also love it as a consumer. So
fantastic. There you go.
All the best of luck to you. That's all I can say.
Thank you so much, Rory. Thank you so much for joining today. And everyone else, thank you for joining and tuning in. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
quite exceptional, wasn't it? I mean, there's just so much to down. Sutherland's Law, just plainly sort of made up, but very, very good. You had some WPP bants in there. The word niche. I'm not going to question Rory Sutherland, but what a fantastic word, niche, and a couple of absolutely eye-watering Hawaiian shirts. More comments about the Hawaiian shirts in the YouTube comments than anything else, I think. I love the point that Rack made from Danielette, the founder of Spotify, in saying, why are our eyes worth 10 times more than our ears? There's a brilliant podcast with Marco from Spotify on the IAB UK podcast, actually, if you want to listen to more about that. And Rory saying that he thinks podcasting and B2B have got a massive opportunity because we're just not doing stuff face-to-face anymore. And this podcast driving up idea, the idea that an algorithm could compile some podcasts, put them together for you based on your journey time frame, just sounds brilliant. Somebody please do that. That would be amazing. And the mention of Case File as well, which, bit of trivia, John Mew, IAB CEO, it's his favourite podcast. To quote, he says, "I love a real life murder," just in podcast form, we hope. Perhaps you'll let us know, John. We've got so much still to come. Talent-wise, Oprah, Frank Skinner, Sue Perkins, Simon Thomas. I feel like I'm on sort of comic relief reading out these things here. Jonathan Van Ness. We've got so much coming up. But if you're a fan of snail porridge and other gastronomic wizardry, then this next session is going to be bang up your street. Here to introduce Audioboom's podcast up front, it's Mike Newman.
So for those who don't know, we are a podcasting company and we host content, we distribute content and we monetize content, and we do that for ourselves. We do some Audioboom original shows, and we also host content for creators across the UK, the US, and the world over, really. We have some of the world's biggest podcasts in our network. And it is those podcasts that we have seen grow incredibly over the last year, even in very, very challenging times for the world over the last 6 months. We've still seen incredible growth, in many cases double-digit percentage growth for our podcast network. And these figures here from Triton Digital Podcast Reports, which are unique for us in the UK, show that we have in August delivered 90 million global downloads, 13.5 million of which have been right here in the UK. That offering, in terms of reaching an audience with your commercial messages, is for Audioboom all about the embedded live read. And there's some figures here from global data from Podsights that talks about the power of the embedded live read versus the dynamically inserted live read that some of the industry uses as well. And you can see that over 60% more conversions are coming from embedded content. 27% better purchase rate comes from those embedded host reads that you find in Audioboom shows. And it leads to almost 70% better lead generation when you're looking at an Audioboom host read message in our podcasts about your content. And furthermore, we've also conducted a UK-based piece of research for our UK podcasts in the Audioboom network. We spoke to almost 1,500 respondents about their attitudes to advertising in podcasts and how those podcasts and those adverts really do engage with them. And the results were incredible. So 55% of people questioned said that they pay more attention to podcast adverts than they do adverts in any other medium. 88% agree that those podcasts help to grow awareness of the product or service that is being talked about in the podcast. And nearly 60% of those people say that it influences their purchasing decision. And I think most excitingly, over 50%, so 54% have made a purchase after hearing an ad in an Audioboom podcast. It's an incredible time for podcasting in what is perhaps the most challenging time that we will face in the global economy. And I think when it comes to marketing budgets that are going to be stretched and scrutinized like never before, to be able to see those kind of numbers and those kind of guarantees about ad effectiveness, impactfulness, and ultimately success in podcasting and in Audioboom's podcast network, I think is really encouraging to see. So the first show I want to talk to you about is a new Audioboom original called Huddled Masses. And earlier I caught up with the host, Alex Hannaford. So our ambition around original content continues to grow at Audioboom. And one of the first shows that we ever released as part of the Audioboom Originals Network was a show called Dead Man Talking. It went on to become a British Podcast Award winner. It was selected in Apple and Spotify's end-of-year polls as one of the podcasts of the year. And it managed to pick up over 3 million listens during its lifetime. Dead Man Talking was an absolute bona fide Audioboom original hit, and I'm really pleased to say that I'm joined now by the host of that show to tell us about his new show, Huddled Masses. Again, we're taking social distancing to the max. Alex joins us now from upstate New York. Is that right, Alex?
That's right, yeah.
So, Huddled Masses, it is the story of real Americans during what I think we can all agree is probably one of the most pivotal times in America's history. Tell us about the show. What's the motivation behind it?
Yeah, so I mean, I've lived in the States for about 16 years, and I don't think America has ever seemed more divided. So Huddled Masses is kind of looking at America at that pivotal, like you said, moment of change. So the first series that we're working on is called Battleground. So it's to do with the election. It's a long-form interview podcast about the presidential election, which really, has become a referendum on Trump. But I mean, we're looking at all the kind of hot button issues around it.
And I mean, with this show and equally with Dead Man Talking, I think you are talking to people whose voices are either never heard or are forgotten. How important is that to you? And how important do you think the medium of the podcast is in helping tell those stories, that getting those voices heard?
Yeah, I mean, it's, the whole kind of concept behind it was to find people who could sort of talk about issues that seem to be so divisive in the States at the moment. So, the podcast medium is brilliant because we want to get those voices out. If you're in your car and you're listening to someone talking about the coronavirus, for example, we've got an interview with a New York City ER doctor who is sort of incredulous as to how this has become politicized. So just giving him a kind of platform. In fact, he said to us he's never done an interview as long as this before. So it's about 40 minutes of him and me talking about how the hell did this happen. And each episode is a different interview, like I said. So just to kind of give you a flavour, we've got an interview with a British woman who is transgender, and she sat on the Obama 2008 leadership circle for LGBTQ rights. So she talks about the bathroom bill and the Supreme Court decisions and stuff like that, and it's just really interesting to listen to somebody whose experience will be very different from a lot of the listeners. So, to give them a sense of, maybe I understand what this person is going through, rather than just reading a few headlines or watching YouTube videos and kind of having an opinion which is sort of fairly uninformed.
Alex, it sounds like it's going to be a fascinating series, and I really can't wait to hear it. Can't wait for everybody to hear it. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for telling us about Huddled Masses.
Thanks a lot. Have a good one.
And Huddled Masses is available to listen wherever you get your podcasts. And there are other new exciting shows as well within the Audioboom network. So we have welcomed Dope Black Dads and Dope Black Women to our stable, the award-winning Dope Black Dads. Also, The Good, The Bad and The Rugby, which is the UK's #1 rugby show, and for a time over the summer was the UK's #1 show. So very happy to welcome the gentleman into the Audioboom family. Of course, you've already heard about Huddled Masses, our Audioboom original show. On the way, I will be catching up with Heston Blumenthal to talk through his show, Journey to the Centre of Food. And here's a few other people to talk about their shows that are on the way.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks to the IAB and the Upfront event for letting me be part of this. I am looking into the managers that I had during my 22-year career. And I had 22 managers during that time as well. I've done my research. I want to know what they were really thinking. I want to know what they really wanted to say to some of those difficult characters that they had to manage. I wasn't one of the difficult characters, by the way. My new podcast is called Dion's Gaffer Tapes. I thought of the name. Thank you very much. It's coming in the autumn. And I just want to say another huge thank you to Audioboom as well for allowing me to put this on your platform. I'm looking forward to it. If you love your football and you want a bit of an insight into those managers, this is going to be right up your street. Look out for it. Dion's Gaffer Tapes.
Hello, I'm Gabby Roslin, and I would love to tell you all about my brand new podcast. It's all about entertainment, fun, positivity. That's what we're going to be bringing to you in the shape of some fantastic guests. Now, this isn't a show about how to bake banana bread or how to skin a fish. This is purely and simply about fun and entertainment and positivity. Its title is That Gabby Roslin Podcast. It's just as it says, That Gabby Roslin Podcast. Now, the guests that we've got lined up, take a deep breath because I'm very overexcited. In fact, when I found out, I screamed. We have Dame Judi Dench and her daughter, Finty Williams. We have Richard E. Grant. We have Robbie Williams. In fact, there are so many more, and I'm not going to list them all to you. I don't want to spoil the surprise, but please listen. I really am beyond excited. In fact, when I got the email saying they said yes, this is what I did. Yes! Anyway, please listen. That Gabby Roslin Podcast. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to what an adult human lady looks like first thing in the morning with no makeup on. I'm Sue Perkins. You might know me for leaving some of the most successful shows on television, and now I'm doing a podcast, an hour or so with Sue Perkins. Now, format-wise, I'm not going to lie, it's not the most complex thing for you to get your heads around. It's basically me sitting here during a pandemic in my pants, nattering to friends, to colleagues, to people I've loved and admired from afar, spending 60 seconds or thereabouts. It's not pre-planned, it's completely improvised. It's what's happening in the moment between the two of us. There's no agenda, there's no puff piece, there's no PR teams present, there's no corporate reaching out. It's a little bit like this video, to be honest. It's a little slapdash. It's a little rough around the edges. And there's always that embarrassing moment at the very end where you can't work out where the off button is.
Really excited to hear those podcasts when they arrive. Please do look out for them wherever you get your podcasts. Almost there. Earlier on, I spoke to celebrity chef and new podcaster Heston Blumenthal about his show, Journey to the Centre of Food. And finally today, I'm pleased to say I have one more very special guest left to join us. His podcast, Journey to the Centre of Food, is a deep dive inside the food we eat, exploring the very core of our simplest ingredients. He's a chef, a writer, a broadcaster, a TV star, and now a podcaster. Welcome, Heston Blumenthal.
Thank you.
Welcome to the IAB Upfronts. Thank you for joining us. So it looks absolutely gorgeous where you are. Just tell us where you are, Heston.
I'm about 45-50 minutes west of Marseille, near Saint-Rémy de Provence, in Provence, in a national park called Les Alpilles.
Sounds absolutely idyllic. And we are, of course, taking social distancing to the max, putting you on a different time zone in a different country. So thank you very much for joining us. So Heston, your podcast, Centred to the Journey of Food, is, I think, like much of your work, it's about food, but it's about so much more than food, isn't it? It's about science, it's history, it's food. What is it about the podcast that appeals to you and you think will appeal to listeners?
I think that, in essence, what we're looking at here is the invisible making the visible. It's the stuff we can't see that produces the stuff we can see. And we tend to look only at the stuff that we can see or the stuff that we can hear. But all of those things generate emotions in us. And an awareness of an emotion is a feeling. So what I'm fascinated in, and have been for years, I'm just much more aware of it now, is our relationship with food. And the most intimate relationship a human being has, I think, is with themselves and their breath. It's like we're all on our own sort of hero's journey, to use a storytelling template of the hero's journey. We connect with that template because we're all on it ourselves, each one of us. And that also means the potential ability to discover more about ourselves, to learn more about us and our relationship with our planet, this incredible planet that we live on and that we're part of. And by exploring, Jay came up with the deep delving phrase. I thought of it recently as one way, interesting way to say it was emotional seasoning.
Oh, I like that. That works.
Because it's on every level, through cooking and through eating. So through the objects of food, let's say, we can start to look at our relationship with food more. And this is what we want to explore in these podcasts. And the fact that after the relationship with ourselves and our breath, which is the most important thing we have to do to live, after breathing is drinking and eating. And then sleeping. And then if we do those things, we can get on with doing all the other important things in our life. And I think that our relationship with food is what has shaped us uniquely as human beings. It's what's shaped the formation of our bodies and brains and gut and all of these other things from a biological point of view that has led to this incredible ability to imagine things that don't exist. And through that imagination, we can then create and have created shared beliefs. And those shared beliefs range from science and education through to social media and telephones, from music to art, from podcasts to storytelling. But it's come from imagination, and that's come from questioning. So questioning, imagining, questioning, curiosity leading to discovery.
And you are discovering that in every single episode. And is the medium of the podcast allowing you to do that ever more than you have before? Because it is I think the beauty of podcasting is that you can delve deeper than in many other media. Are you finding that as you're entering into podcasting more and more?
Yes, I'm loving it. I'm loving it more than any other, I think, media platform that I've done. It also helps. I've got Jay asking me questions, and Jay has this ability. It's like, kids ask questions that adults can be a little bit at first embarrassed about, but they're questions they really wanted to ask themselves, but they were too embarrassed to ask the question because they might have sounded stupid. But they're the questions that lead to discoveries. They're the questions that, as I said, the questions that we want to answer, but we're too scared of asking them.
Absolutely. And for those people who haven't yet heard the podcast, Jay, tell us who Jay is. He's the listener, really, in this.
Jay Taylor is Mr. Director Pants, as he's been known, has come to be known over.
Official title.
Yes, and we have made many television programs, which have not necessarily the priority order of importance of what they were set out to do. They were set out to produce a TV show that was food centric, but they really have all explored our relationship with food. And Jay and I have travelled to the ends of the earth and eaten some pretty extreme things in the process. Maybe myself a bit more than Jay. He's got the excuse / benefit of hiding behind the camera.
He says you have an ironclad stomach as well. So
yes, that's both a benefit and a hindrance.
And in terms of the knowledge that you have and the knowledge that you share on the podcast, I mean, you probably know more about food than most people have forgotten in their lifetimes. But what have you learned over the course of the podcast? And what is it that keeps you going and keeps you delving into those different ingredients?
I think because this subject, I realised our relationship with food, which goes from hunting, gathering, farming, transporting and packaging and cooking and eating and sharing, it covers everything from physics to chemistry, from biology to history, from geography to philosophy, from music and art through to geology, evolution, and crazily things like from string theory to quantum physics. Is you can connect all of these things with food, because without food we would not have evolved in the creative way that we evolved. We would not evolve in that creative way to be able to form big groups of people working together to produce stuff. So there's hundreds of things to discover about ourselves. So it's the universe inside of us and how it relates and interacts with the universe outside of us.
And it's exactly that kind of exploration we can expect in forthcoming episodes and more of the podcast. So excited to hear more from you, Heston. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from France. It's been a pleasure.
Mike, thank you very much.
Heston's show is out now, Journey to the Centre of Food. Thank you so much for joining us today at the IAB Upfronts. Hopefully in 2021 we can do it all in person, but have a great day.
Mike Newman and guests for Audioboom there. No one told me about Dion Dublin. Dion Dublin would have got a name check in the talent along with Oprah and Jonathan Van Ness. What an absolute legend. I love Sue Perkin. Sue Perkin, sell the podcast. It's a little slapdash. It's a little rough around the edges. I'm sure it'll be absolutely brilliant. Mike made a really nice point around it being such an incredible time for podcasting, despite the backdrop of that being an incredibly tough time probably for marketers and stress on marketing budgets. And I think that's probably something to keep in mind as you watch these. And of course, the mention of, it couldn't go without the mention of Heston's ironclad stomach, which I sort of rather liked. So from a little slapdash to something slightly more polished and a bit more eloquent, and perhaps not the man you think to present it all, with a little piece on poetry and lots more, here to present Bauer Media's podcast Upfront. It's Emily Dean in conversation with the brilliant Frank Skinner.
Frank Skinner, welcome.
Hello.
I'm saying that as if this is my apartment, but it's not. We should explain in case people don't realise, because we're not normally seen together. We're normally an audio pairing.
No, we do a radio show together, so I don't like that thing when people pretend that they don't know each other when they know each other, so we know each other.
I've got no shame that we're friends.
You know when you do a chat show and somebody walks on and you shake hands with them, even though you've just been talking to them backstage for 10 minutes? It's a weird
well, we
thing.
normally do the radio show together on Absolute. This, I'm seeing this as sort of an Ethel and Dot on EastEnders spin-off, like when they talk about ration books for half an hour. But we won't be talking about that. We're going to be talking about your side hustle. Can I call it that?
Well, please do.
Frank Skinner's poetry podcast.
The idea that a poetry podcast could be a side hustle. Yes, I've decided to go, corporate and as commercial I can be, and do a poetry podcast. I've already done a series of it, and then there is a second series. I I believe the phrase is in the offing.
And I know, I was going to say you don't like praise. You do like praise. You don't
No,
like...
I don't like prose.
Okay.
You got mixed
You
up.
don't like praise.
No, I do.
But
I
you don't
love
like
praise.
to toot your own horn too much, so I can do that for you and say, I got the sense you were surprised at how phenomenally successful it's been. It's been received, I mean, critically and sort of commercially, it's been really successful. Were you surprised, Frank, be honest?
Yeah, I thought it would be, because often I'm not surprised. I remember I did Question of Sport once and Sue Barker said to me, were you surprised when Three Lions was at #1? And I said, no. Sort of guessed it would be. But this was a passion project, the poetry podcast. I thought it would slide by, and as long as nobody found out, it wouldn't get slagged off. And then somebody said to me, oh, God, it's got a 5-star review in the Times and all that. And I didn't even know that 5-star reviews sort of existed anymore. I thought that it was a bit 1990s. So yeah, I was gobsmacked by that. And then the most exciting thing is that I looked at a book of poetry called Model City by an American writer called Donna Stonecipher, who I love, but who is not a household name. I got an email from her, who I didn't know her, and just saying how much she'd loved it. And then, like, she sold an extra 600 copies of her book, which in poetry book terms is like winning the lottery. So, yeah, that was great. For the actual poet to get in touch, fantastic.
When you pitched it initially, was there a part of you that felt a bit trepidatious about that? You know, in terms of their possible reaction to it?
Well, I didn't pitch it. What happened was I did an interview with a newspaper, the name of which I can't remember. And I quoted, I was talking about how one's career changes over, you go from being favour of the month to just being around. And I said, they flee from me that sometime did me seek, which is a line from a poem by Sir Thomas Wyatt, which is like a Tudor poet. And then we talked about poetry, and she said, oh, you should do a poetry podcast. I said, yeah, I'd love to do that. Then the headline said, Frank Skinner to do poetry podcast. So and then I didn't do one. And so I just thought that was a funny episode. And then Bauer, who run Absolute Radio and who run our radio show ultimately, they said, would you like to do a poetry podcast for us? And I said, what? What's happened? Poetry suddenly become a commodity. I think people think commercial radio and stuff like that it's just adverts for the local betting shop. And then, you play Coldplay and that's it. And I think it's more than that. So they said, would you like to do a poetry podcast? And I said, yes, please.
You see, I'm very excited because we get the odd sort of Biffy Clyro cupcake through, the promotional merchandise. Now, Alfred Tennyson baseball caps. That's what I think I'm going to be getting.
Yes, and people send me poetry books, which is fab. I mean, the thing is, it is such a joyous thing because I was reading it anyway, and now I'm reading it and I'm just writing more stuff in the margins. And that is basically the difference. It's stuff I love talking about. It's great. I was offered a TV presenting job of a 3-part show about Formula One. And I get like Jackie Stewart was going to drive me in this supercar around the scary roads of Monaco or whatever. And I said, don't offer me this. Offer it to someone who actually likes Formula One and cars. And I like it when you watch a programme and you think, oh, this person, they're not just doing this, they actually really like this. So I am happy to be doing the poetry thing because I'm a big fan of the genre.
Well, you are a fan, and partly the reason why I think people have enjoyed it and praised it, and certainly the reason I enjoyed it, is that you very much approach it as a fan. And I feel whenever I hear poetry, I feel a bit like I'm being lectured and told this is, and you're approaching it saying, this to me seems it's this way. You sound like you could be talking about a Radiohead album that you love.
Yeah, well, I don't think there's any difference, really. I think being a poetry fan, being a football fan is the same thing. I read a line of poetry. This happened to me yesterday. I read a line of poetry, and it was about cowboys on the Western Plains and the intensity of the experience, the heat, the lack of water, the horror of it. And one of them said, "The day's gone immortal. So the day never ends, it never ends." And I just went, whoa, what a line that is. And that is, honestly, it's like a little electric shock thing.
Why do you think, Frank, people are a bit suspicious? Like, do you know what I mean by that? Like fearful of poetry in a way?
I think it's seen as a bit wet, isn't it? And a bit weird. I remember there was a guy who was accused of a murder, and one of the tabloid papers decided that he'd done it. And part of their evidence was they said, and apparently he owns over 1,000 books, many of them poetry. Guilty.
I remember that particular tabloid. And
Yeah.
you know when the prose is sort of, it's like in bold and it said weirdo and there was a colon and it said, yeah, owned thousands of poetry books.
Yeah, I think because people think they have a vague memory of "I wandered lonely as a cloud" or something like that, and it sounds very ephemeral. But in fact, like so many things, if you find the right bits and the good bits, it's like people say, I try hard with classical music, but I've never really. And I think what you've got to do is if someone says, "Oh, you'll like this and you'll like this," and you get that right, because there is no. You know, if somebody said to me, I decided to get into football, so I went to see Worksop. I didn't think it was very entertaining. It's like that, but the part of the programme is evangelical. It says, read this poet and you'll find out how good it can be.
How did you get into poetry then? Was it something that you, when you were sort of young, were you a child or were you a teenager?
I was asked to read a poem in the school assembly when I think I was 11. And it was a poem called "Sometime During Eternity." And there was a group called the Beat Poets who were all seriously into drugs and sexual freedom, etc., etc.
They would have been my friends.
So there I am, aged 11, reading this poem, and it's in sort of New York vernacular. And I had no idea poetry could be like that. And that got me really interested in it. And there was a little slim volume of Penguin modern poets called The Mersey Sound. And it was Roger McGough, Brian Patton and Adrian Henry. And they wrote poems about chip shops and being on the bus at night. So we've all got this idea of what poetry is like, but actually it's like everything.
And it's really personal. That's the sense I get from your podcast, listening to your podcast, because it feels like a very personal journey. You're sort of saying, I like it for this reason. And your style is very conversational, isn't it? You bring your own life into it a lot.
Yeah, I just, all the stuff I've done, audio-wise, like the radio show, is an exchange of ideas, and it's coming back with quick one-liners and stuff. And I really wanted to try just talking, just me. I just wanted to try me. No disrespect. I was
waiting for that
I just wanted to see what a monologue would feel like at sort of half an hour, and if I could carry that off.
Do you get the sense that it's seen as quite a middle-class thing, poetry, that as someone who, you grew up in a working-class family, didn't you? You've said that. So was there a sense of you feeling that door was closed to you?
Yeah, probably. I mean, there weren't many books in our house. I'd say there was about 7 books in our house when I was growing up. I lived on comic books completely. But I think I like words. I like words then. I think we were a very verbal family jokey. My dad sang a lot. So there was lots of interesting sort of verbal stuff going on. And if you have any interesting words, then I think poetry is really like chocolate cake with icing on, because it is a word fest. You know, this is people who love language showing you what they can do with it, which is pretty amazing.
And in some ways, it does make a lot of sense. I'm going to have to quote Will Gompertz, now the BBC Arts editor. He referred to you as a very welcome addition to the cultural landscape. Discuss.
Yeah, it's interesting that I'm seen, I think, in some... All the reviews sort of say this. It's a bit of a surprise. Who'd think Frank Skinner? I think that's the accent, I think, more than anything. And I know people say social mobility and all this, but in fact, Will Gompertz sounds like he should be talking about poetry and looks like it as well. And I don't think I do, and I think that's incorrect. I feel like a sort of a dull elder statesman, because there's all these spoken word, super cool poetry happenings going on right across Britain. I've never really been to one. I'd like to, you know, what I need is some sort of 17-year-old black woman to take me to one of these clubs and show me what that's about. So I feel quite, even though I talk about contemporary poetry, I feel there's a whole area there which is alive and exciting, which I don't know about.
You've also written a book called Frank Skinner, well, it's How to Enjoy Poetry, isn't it, by Frank Skinner. I wanted to know, I mean, I loved it. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. And I read it. I wouldn't be here otherwise. I would have called in sick. I would have made an excuse. But again, that real passion you have for it just comes over so strongly.
Well, that book wouldn't have happened, of course, had it not been for the podcast. And in fact, there were 6 podcasts in the first series when the second one went out. So there'd been 2 out there. I got 2 separate book offers to write a book about poetry. So, you know, the power of the pod. It was kind of amazing.
Yeah.
I only did 1 of them, but there's still time. So, yeah, that was just, they said we want it to, you know, we want it to be a bit like the podcast and to feel, you know, we don't want it to be a book. And it's just me sort of riffing and getting excited about one poem.
You said that you wouldn't write poetry yourself. Do you think you change your mind?
I know one thing I don't do is write it. The joy for me is reading a poem for the first time and there'll just be one phrase, one line where you think, oh, you know when you're at a bar and you look across, think back, and you see, you know, that person, you think, oh, and it's just something about the way the nose connects to the mouth. Just something about it, you think, oh, God, I like that person. And a poem is a bit like that. One line and you think, oh. And if I was writing it, it would be like, I saw Derren Brown live and I went backstage to see him after. And I was frightened he was going to tell me how he'd done some of it, because I never want to know how it's done. I just want to enjoy the show. And that's what I'm like with poetry. I don't want to be making it. I want to be the one who gets to open the doors and finds all this stuff that's been made.
Well, I think what you're doing is bringing poetry home. That will be said in some headlines somewhere.
Poetry's coming home.
Poetry's coming home, Frank. And I want to personally thank you to tell you something which I don't think I've ever told you, which is, you know how if you're named after someone, your son is called Buzz. He's named after...
Buzz Aldrin, yeah.
Yeah. I was talking to Scarlett Moffat. She said she was named after Scarlett O'Hara. It's quite a common thing that you'll bring up.
I wish she'd been named after Captain Scarlett. but never mind.
But what I'm saying is, if you're named after a cultural icon, you normally discuss it. I don't think you know.
You weren't named after Emily Dickinson.
I was.
Was you really?
But what fascinates me is that I've never told you that, and I've known you a long time. And I think it's honestly because I feel it sounds pretentious. I'm going to use the past tense. I felt it sounded pretentious and that people would think, oh, yeah, Emily Dickinson. Now, I'm going to tell people. And that's because of your podcast and your book.
Oh, well, that's splendid. You're right, though. I never knew that. And it's good. Why not? I went to Birmingham Polytechnic. That was where I did my English degree, the first one. And we had a lecturer there who taught me Wordsworth, and I'm doing Wordsworth in the second series. And William Wordsworth is probably the poet that most people have heard of. And this, I didn't really know any of his stuff. And this guy, he loved it so much, and he came in and he said, "Oh, I'm so happy I'm going to share this with you." And it was great, and I can still remember that feeling. This guy absolutely fired me up for it. And that is, if I can do a bit of that, that would make me joyously happy.
I want to ask you finally, what do you think about, this thing about the syllabus and the curriculum? Have you been hearing about this? That there were suggestions they would take it off and then they're putting it back on now. What do you think about that? Do you think poetry should be on the GCSE syllabus?
Well, I don't think it was ever taken off. I think it was an option that you could opt out of, you could avoid. I mean, what I would urge the brighter children, I would say to you that you will learn a great deal about life, about language, about form, about structure, about order in life. You'll learn how beauty can be constructed by the human mind, and what a joy that is. And for the less bright kids, I'd say it's much shorter than reading a novel. And so I urge them all to opt for it, whatever their reasons.
I can't think of a better place to end it on that. Frank Skinner, thank you for bringing poetry home.
It's coming home, it's coming, poetry's coming home. I mean, you heard it here first. What a brilliant line to end on. 3 Frank Skinner takeaways for me. His discovery, very specifically, of Tudor-style poetry. Doesn't like any of the contemporary stuff. Disputing that local radio is just adverts for the local betting shop. And he doesn't want to write any poetry. He gets all the joy from reading it, of course, and finding that one beautiful line. And just to sell you into the second series, it's Wordsworth who's up next, which will be unmissable. It was one of those conversations that could have just gone on for so long, just so easy to listen to him and watch him. Frank was absolutely brilliant, and head to toe in green as well. I mean, why not? We got so much more coming up, which is why you should stay with us. Of course, we've got Oprah coming up. We've got Jonathan Van Ness. We've got Jamila Jamil. We've got a whole load more in this next session as well in terms of talent, which is Bauer Media's up front. And all that's left for me to do, it's not Bauer Media, of course. This is why it's live, because it's DAX, because we just have Bauer Media. So from DAX, talking to Simon Thomas and a whole bunch of other people, let's hand over to Brad from DAX.
Hi guys. Firstly, I want to thank you all for taking the time to join us for our session. You're going to hear a lot today about how the podcast market is maturing in the UK and growing to encompass new and bigger audiences. But as the audience grows, what I want to focus on in this session is how the breadth and tone of the content we're listening to is also changing. The reason we choose to spend up to an hour with the podcasts we love has always been because they spark our curiosity and make us laugh. But now, increasingly, it's also because they can act as a source of comfort and support. Today, with everything that's happening in the world around us, it's never been more important to have conversations that may be difficult or uncomfortable. Podcasts are creating a safe space to have these discussions where other media can't. You might not feel comfortable sitting in your living room with your family, watching a programme on TV about dealing with anxiety. And likewise, you may not want to announce the way you're feeling on social media through the influencers and content you choose to follow and like. But when you listen to a podcast, it's a conversation between you and that host, totally discreet. Hosts share some of their most intimate experiences and feelings, and it's this authenticity that creates the perfect space for brands wanting to tell their story. Even back in 2019, 64% of Gen Z and wanted companies to take a stand on the social, cultural, environmental and political issues closest to their hearts. And over half of UK consumers say their purchasing consideration is driven by a company's ethical values and authenticity. This means there's a clear reason for brands to engage with these topics. But to really understand why podcasts are the best place to do this, we need to speak to the podcasters themselves. To do that, we're going to start off by speaking to broadcaster and author Simon Thomas. After a career with the BBC and Sky Sports, Simon now hosts a successful podcast on Global Player, Life Interrupted with Simon Thomas. Simon, thanks for joining us today, mate. It's much appreciated. For anyone who hasn't listened to Life Interrupted, can you give us a quick overview of what the podcast is actually about?
Well, the podcast idea for Life Interrupted came out of an event that I went through, a couple of events nearly 3 years ago. I firstly came away from broadcasting at Sky with very bad depression, anxiety and panic attacks. I went through a very bad interruption to life, which was mental health problems, but then very suddenly, out of nowhere, my wife fell in with cancer and died within 3 days. So if you talk about a life interruption, that was as big as it got. But I think as the months went on, I spoke to so many other people who'd gone through not maybe something exactly like that, but big life events where life had suddenly gone in a completely different direction that they didn't expect, had taken them to a very low place. But you'd hear their stories of how they came through it and how different, and actually, in many of the cases, how good life was now. And I thought there's something in this, that life can throw at us some really bad things, some really tough challenges, but there is always a way through. And I wanted to have a podcast that would challenge people, but also infuse them with hope that whatever life brings you, even if it's really, really difficult, there's a narrow way through.
Yeah. I mean, clearly tackling some very sensitive, potentially difficult subjects there. What was it about podcasting as a medium that made you think this is the right way to broach these topics?
I'm so used to doing live television. I did Sky Sports for years, the football, and I'm so used to interviewing people where you're always on a time limit. There's always someone in your ear going 1 minute to go. And yeah, football's very different to what we're talking about in Life Interrupted. But what I loved about getting into podcasts, and in particular this one, is just that freedom to explore stuff. Yes, occasionally there's an agent waiting outside the door and saying, come on, you only got 10 minutes more. But sometimes they'll tell you something really amazing and fascinating. Like a guy called Duncan Slater interviewed, had both his legs blown off in Afghanistan, but has lived this most amazing life since. And I asked him towards the end, if you could go back and change what happened on that day all those years ago when you hit that landmine, would you? He went, no. A remarkable answer. The podcast gives you the freedom to then explore that, go in a completely different direction. And you also get a level of honesty that I don't think you get anywhere else, because it's a very intimate thing. It's just essentially me and the guest sat in the room, chewing the cud, talking these big issues through and listening to their story. You get that freedom, you get that intimacy that I don't think you get anywhere else. And with a subject like this, whether we're talking about mental health, we're talking about grief, or we're just talking about a life-transforming event, it gives us that intimacy, but also just that trust between the two of us that, yeah, you understand a little bit of what I'm going through and have gone through, and I'm okay to talk about it. And it's an amazing thing. And I think for the people listening, they feel like they've been invited into this room, just them and you and the other guests, to listen to an incredible story.
It's interesting you talk about the intimacy with both the guests on the podcast and the listener. Obviously, you've worked across a whole bunch of different media. That connection with the listener, is that something that you found is kind of more apparent, I suppose almost dialed up a notch through podcasting compared to other forms of media? And do you get the listeners getting in touch with you, kind of commenting on how listening to your podcast has affected them?
Absolutely. I think what I've found is that when you talk about tough stuff in life, you know, if it is an area like grief, which is an area of life we still find very difficult to vocalize and talk about with our friends, let alone anybody else. And what I found in doing the podcast is the comments you get afterwards is about how much it's helped them, not just to understand themselves a little bit more, but to understand that biggest thing in life we need. When we struggle with something, when we're going through illness, whatever it might be, it's that feeling we're not alone. That's incredibly powerful. And I think that's what the podcast does, Life Interrupted does, and numerous others do. It connects with people and says, look, life can be really, really crap sometimes, but you are not alone. And that's a connection that's very hard to get anywhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose as we start having more and more of these difficult conversations, as they're becoming more prevalent and becoming more aware of them in society as a whole, more brands are starting to engage with difficult topics of conversation. Now, obviously, you need to do this carefully. I mean, what advice would you give to brands who are looking to engage with people in these areas? And have you seen any examples that you think are particularly good where they've done that well?
Well, I don't want to take this as a sign of things to do with my podcast, but one of the first advertisers got in touch and said, actually, would you voice over this advertising campaign we want to run in conjunction with a podcast? It was for erectile dysfunction. I mean, my podcast is called Life Interrupted. That sounded like Love Interrupted.
Absolutely.
But we won't go there. But it gives brands an amazing opportunity to tap into particular areas. Like, you know, with the podcast I'm doing, you know, health and well-being is part of it. That's one of the categories it sits in. So it gives companies an opportunity to go, this is a specific marketplace that we want to advertise in. And we've got then a very direct access to a particular audience. And that isn't offered in the same way anywhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously you're working on your second series at the moment. Given everything that's happening around the world, kind of in times we're currently in, what are you doing differently? How are you approaching this, I suppose, to reflect the current times?
Well, I think there's a plus and a minus to it. The plus is we've just had the biggest life interruption that any of us have gone through, and it's been a global thing. It's been a nationwide thing. It's not just been a few of us going through. It's been all of us. We've all had life as we knew it interrupted. So I think that's going to open up some fascinating conversations in terms of how people dealt with isolation, with loneliness, with struggling with relationships, with homeschooling kids. There's a plethora of layers to this, the loss of identity, the loss of jobs. The downside of it is I find it really good when I'm sat like we're sat now, and I can judge not just through the voice, but how that person is looking as to where emotionally they're at. And you don't always get that through just hearing their voice. And for the time being, most of the interviews will be for the second series with me on a pair of headphones and a microphone. We'll try and get a video link up, but sometimes the sync's slightly out. So I will miss having that person sat in the same studio and just feeling that really close connection, which I don't think I'll get in quite the same way. But I think we're going to get a whole different level of content because of what everyone's gone through, and actually we're still going through.
Yeah, absolutely. Simon, thank you so much for your time today. Much appreciated.
Loved it, pleasure.
Thank you, Simon. And now we're going to hear from some more of our amazing podcast talent.
I've decided to come up with this brand new concept. Podcasts. They ain't been done yet.
Well, first of all, introduce it. It's Confessions of a Modern Parent.
Hi, I'm Imriel Morgan. I'm the host of Wannabe.
Hi, it's JK here from Heart. I do a show with Kelly Brook, but what you may not know is I also do a podcast for dads called Don't Tell Your Mum.
Hi, I'm Frankie Bridge, and I created my podcast, Open Mind, to start the conversation about mental health.
Hello, I'm Josh Widdicombe.
Hello, I'm Rob Beckett.
And we are the hosts of Lockdown Parenting Hell podcast.
Hi, my name's Gemma and I'm working with Global on a new podcast called Good Influence.
I host a number of podcasts, but one of them is Ian Dale All Talk, and that stems from my Edinburgh Fringe show, so I interview comedians, politicians, some big names.
It's called Life Changing. What points in your life led up to this moment today? Like, why am I chatting to you? How did this podcast happen? Who brought you here? What is you? What is life?
Right Minded will give you everything from ups and downs.
I created Wannabe because my younger sister was applying for university and she didn't really know what she wanted to do. And I remember having a similar crisis as I was younger and not really figuring it out until much, much later in my career, where I'm now ended up in podcasting and in broadcast and audio, which is just like so far from what I could have ever imagined I'd be doing.
Actually, now I can remember initially why we started this was we'd done a topic. No, I had brought it up at Loose Women, that's right. about the loneliness that comes in when you're a parent of a teen. We'd read an article, hadn't we, from America.
I decided to create a podcast because I think it feels like quite a natural format for me. I'm more used to written media than a lot of video that people seem to do these days, which I'm never quite as comfortable with.
Why did you decide to do Lockdown Parenting Hell podcast?
The reason why I wanted to start the podcast is the pandemic hit and all the theatres shut, and I had to postpone my tour. So I wanted to earn, a few quid from my my own home, essentially. What about you?
I wanted to do it because I just thought it was a nice thing to do to help parents that were struggling in a difficult time.
Yeah, that as well. But mainly that was the same for me, really. Not the money was just an added bonus.
Podcasting is extremely powerful. I've been in podcasting for about 5 years, and what I love the most about them is the intimacy and the ability to connect with another person's story so viscerally that you don't really get in other mediums. I think I've definitely been moved by film and documentaries, TV shows, and there is something quite lovely about seeing these stories on screen and seeing them unfold, but there's something quite different in having to listen, not letting the visual distract you or detract from the story.
The main message I want to get across is anyone can change their life at any time. But has there been a podcast that has addressed that issue? Do you want to make a change to your life? Do you want to make a difference? Do you want to improve or make your life even worse? Then tune into Life Changing, because my listeners are going to find a way to change their lives, and this should help them.
I'd say the main message of our podcast is that parenting isn't what it looks like on Instagram. It isn't, I was about to say it isn't fun. It's fun sometimes. It's often...
It's not.
It's not.
Mostly not.
It's mostly not. That's what I'm trying to say.
I think we were being made to feel like bad parents because it was so difficult in lockdown. So, being able to just talk casually and normally about it and interview like some really we've had Jonathan Ross on, Jack D, Peter Crouch, all these big stars. You expect their life so easy, and they were just moaning the same way as everyone else on the school run was moaning. So I think it made people at home feel like, oh well, Peter Crouch is struggling. That's fine if I am.
Exactly. That's the main thing. As long as Crouchy's struggling, Britain's okay.
Podcasts are a great place to delve into mental health issues, depression, issues you've been going through, because if someone like us can discuss them and my guests, then it's even better for you to relate to them. People think we're all living different lives. Essentially, we're all living pretty similar lives because we're sharing this point in this time on this planet at this particular point, and it ain't difficult, it ain't easy, but it's pretty much the same for, well, it is difficult. It's difficult for all of us. Mental health is a big subject, and it's very important for people to relate to each other to help break through those barriers of mental health. Black Lives Matter is very important because now non-white people and entertainers have finally got a chance and an opportunity in the entertainment business. It's good to be here.
As someone that has suffered from depression and anxiety for most of my life, I've realised how alone that can make you feel. And by starting the podcast, I wanted to make others feel heard, to help to understand themselves, and to listen to people who they see on TV or they see in magazines who they assume have this perfect life, to kind of get to know them and to learn that everybody suffers with their mental health in some way or another, no matter who they are or what they do.
It's a safe place for our listeners to understand that everybody goes through ups and downs in life, whatever the job, whether it be a sports star, an entertainment star, a singer, or just the boy next door or the girl next door. And it just allows our listeners to understand they're not alone.
I'm going to be honest, just before, and this is what's so wonderful about having a podcast rather than being on telly with something like this, is that we can let it run and run and run. And often, as we really have to gird our loins sometimes before we go into the studio or into our room, obviously we're in COVID at the moment and recording at home, because we know we're going to dig deep, because That is what we need to do to connect with the audience, for them to come to us rather than to go somewhere else.
These are the conversations you don't typically hear in the public space, and podcasting is definitely opening up the doors for people to have conversations that they would have behind closed doors, having their WhatsApp groups or just in private chats. And now you're kind of eavesdropping, if you will, on these chats between people that you probably ordinarily just would never interact with in your day-to-day lives. I mean, certainly people do gravitate to podcasts that seem like they're people, but there is something very powerful about dropping into these conversations at any time, at any point.
I think of all the kind of mediums, I think podcast feels the most like you're just having a chat. There's no audience who you feel you have to play to, or there's no kind of, oh, I'm on TV, I need to look good, etc., etc. You're just having a chat, essentially down a slightly souped up phone, and I think it means that people are much more honest. And I think, you know, when we started this podcast, I don't think we were thinking, oh, let's talk about postnatal depression, or let's talk about, you know, how difficult various elements of parenting are. But I think, you know, genuinely, you can talk about anything from postnatal depression to finding a shit in a shoe.
Well, exactly. And did you find it easier in episode 7 to discuss your micro penis over the podcast, or, you know?
I did find it easier. And I thought going to Zoom to show you was a mistake.
Yeah, of course. That's why we've since gone back to using just audio. Exactly. But, you know, it's good. You've got to get it off your chest. You don't often get to say that with a micro penis. But it's good to, you know, just be honest about it and let everyone know.
Exactly.
So you've just heard from some of the top podcast hosts in the UK how podcasts create the perfect space to have personal, discreet conversations, and how this can be a brilliant place for brands to truly engage with consumers. Whether the podcast is tackling a difficult subject such as mental health or something altogether more light-hearted, it's a space where you can tap into the relationship between a host and their audience around content that truly matters to them. And by working with DAX, you can also see proof that this approach works. Tracking performance from podcast advertising was always difficult due to the fact the majority of podcasts are listened to in-app. But the addition of cross-device mapping to our Listener Insight ID product means that we can now effectively track online behaviour after a user has been exposed to a podcast ad. I want to thank you again for your time today. I hope it's been useful, and as always, the DAX team are more than happy to answer any questions you might have off the back of this session. Thank you.
Brad from DAX, summing it up rather nicely at the end there. I think what I've loved about these 6, of course you've only seen 5 at the moment, there's so much sort of light and shade between the two of them. Frank Skinner talking about poetry, Chris and Rosie Ramsey having an absolute hoot at the beginning, and then really getting down to some serious stuff with Simon Thomas. And just to be in the room when we were filming that, I mean, it's sort of an incredible thing for him to be able to come and talk about. And the podcast itself is amazing as well. And I think, as he said, he's going to get a completely different take, given we've all had this massive life interruption at the moment with COVID. And good to see that brands are starting to get involved in some of the more sort of difficult discussions as well. And if you haven't already, Parenting How with Josh Widdicombe and Rob Beckett is quite sensational. I mean, you just saw from that, it's absolutely brilliant. And the episode with Peter Crouch, as they say, is one worth watching. We're almost at the finale, the crescendo, if you like, of podcast upfronts. And we've one member left to talk to you, and that is Podfront. In a way, they've almost saved the best till last, because it's Jamila Jamil and it's Jonathan Van Ness and it's Oprah. So here to introduce it and tell you even more, and especially how the whole makeup of Podfront came around, is Ruth Fitzsimons from Podfront to finish us off.
Hello, and welcome to Podfront UK session at the 2020 IAB Upfronts. I'm Ruth Fitzsimons, and I'm the Managing Director at Podfront UK. Podfront UK is a joint venture between 2 of the biggest global podcast players. Wondery, who with their mini-series like Bunga Bunga and Dirty John frequently top the UK charts and are often called the HBO of podcasting. And Stitcher, who with their big-name stars like Mark Maron, Oprah and Jonathan Van Ness are more akin to the Netflix and Amazon Prime of the podcasting space. Except in both cases, you can actually buy against those networks. Our partners create and own many of their own shows, providing you with reliability and flexibility. Our podcasts regularly feature major UK and Hollywood talent, like Jamila Jamil, and are so popular internationally that our partners Wondery are adapting the podcast into TV miniseries with incredible talent like Alec Baldwin, Will Ferrell, and Kate McKinnon. We provide you with an opportunity to connect with British audiences who love this content and to buy in a premium, brand-safe environment. This is the equivalent of being able to buy in Fleabag, Succession, Tiger King, or Ozark. We know podcasting has grown in scale and is reaching audiences in great numbers. But how effective is the messaging delivered through this channel? And at a time when budgets are tight and a return on investment is vital, why should you invest in the medium? At Podfront, we believe in the importance of research and consumer insights. So if you want a deep dive on how podcasts affect memory and our brains thanks to Wondery and Mindshare's Neuralab, or if you need a comprehensive case study on brand uplift or purchasing intent, we have it. Our audience surveys by our partners are second to none. Running since 2019 in the UK on each individual podcast, we've had nearly 5,000 UK respondents. So we can tell you on a per podcast basis if it reaches decision makers. We can also tell you if it connects with podcast listeners of a particular age group or the media habits of that listener, so you can make better decisions about your spend. Over the last year, we've offered a range of services to allow you to align your brand with our premium hit shows. From custom solutions and sponsorships to host reads, producer reads, and spot airtime, as well as a programmatic solution. Not only can you connect with UK audiences, but you can manage global buys out of the UK at scale. We're very proud of our growth in our first year of business. And our brand count, it grew fourfold since January. So thank you so much to all the brands and agencies who've worked with us in 2020. Well, our biggest strength remains the incredible content that we represent. Everyone loves a good story, and more than most, our partners Wondery understand this.
From Wondery. From Wondery. From Wondery. From Wondery. From Wondery.
I don't know if you ever listened to Wondery. It's amazing. They're really good.
You know, there are 200 zillion audio options. This was #1 on the Apple list.
Podcast captured the nation's attention this fall.
My son called and said, "Dad, go listen to Dirty Job."
People were just gripped by this podcast. It was so well done.
Greetings, all you cool cats and kittens.
All of us at NBC News are thrilled about our partnership with Wondery.
You know, I'm a fan of the Wondery brand. As soon as I saw it, I was like, I know this is going to be good.
It sort of jumps into unexpected terrain.
Eleanor starts season 2 falling through the sky, literally.
Eight years ago, we saw one of the most dramatic free agencies in NFL history.
The Indianapolis Colts select quarterback Peyton Manning.
This is the story of the rise of the brashest billionaire turned politician the world has ever known.
She was stuck inside of her house, so we decided to do something for her. We just wanted to make her happy.
Sit back, let go, and imagine. Imagine your life.
I am thrilled to be working with Wondery.
Well, if you're commitment phobic, I'm your girl.
Well, I am delighted to introduce the CEO of Wondery, Hernan Lopez. Hernan!
Ruth, how are you? Thank you for having me.
No, I'm absolutely delighted to have you. Thank you so much for joining us. Look, for many people who are listening today, they might not know the Wondery story, and it is an incredible story, just even the startup of this company. So I'm really curious, what inspired the ex-CEO of Fox International, a mere $3 billion company, to set up his own podcast studio?
It's funny. I had been listening to podcasts for about 6 months before I realized that there was a big business opportunity, because people kept telling me, you have to listen to Serial, you have to listen to Serial, you have to listen to Serial. And I said, this has to be something really good about it. So I did. I actually devoured it in about a month, and then listened to Startup from Gimlet, and then went and looked for other shows like them and found nothing. So I wonder why that was, and remember that back in the early, in the turn of the century, there was a shift in the kind of television that got made when The Sopranos became this incredibly gritty, very well-produced, character-driven drama that was meant to be watched serialized. And it dawned on me that Serial was the equivalent, the podcast equivalent of The Sopranos. And then after The Sopranos, we had this great golden age of television that included The Shield and Mad Men and Breaking Bad and Game of Thrones. So my theory was that there was going to be a golden age of audio similar to the golden age of television, and I wanted to be ahead of that curve.
Well, you certainly did that. And, you know, it's so interesting that you mentioned those other podcasts that have become number one on the charts, because that's what you guys are famous for. Is Wondery is famous at creating shows that hit number one in the charts. Just talk to me a little bit about that. How are you consistently producing these incredible chart toppers?
It's well, thank you. We produced the 28th show to be number one in the US with Bunga Bunga, which is still number one as of this morning. I think it's a difference in the way we approach storytelling and the way we look at characters in addition to the story. Up until 2010, 2015, most of the great narrative storytelling podcasts, possibly with the exception of Serial and Startup, were looking at the journalistic side. They were looking at the news angle. They were looking at maybe the host was putting themselves in the story and describing how the host related to the story. We flipped that and we put characters. We put people like Dr. Ike and Dirty John and Christopher Tan from Dr. Death, and very charismatic sometimes, but complex people like Adam Newman from Recrash or James Arthur Ray. And the other thing we do is we want the listeners to feel as if they're in the middle of the story. We want the story to be all about the listeners and all about the characters, not about we telling the story.
So one of the things that we've seen as well is sponsors getting involved in this storytelling. And what I find really interesting is what you guys have been doing with sponsors like Dell, who've sponsored Business Wars. So these more kind of custom solutions. Why do you think that they're so appropriate for brands at the moment?
I think when a brand gets involved in a custom execution, they have more control of making sure that their message resonates with the listeners of the series and the brand's objectives in a way that is difficult to do with a 60-second spot. Not impossible, because 60-second spot that people actually listen to in podcasts are very effective. But when you take a program like what Dell did with Business Wars, tied around Small Business Month, the month of May, and they produce episodes, or actually we produce episodes hand in hand with them, you just get a better window into how consumers are understanding Dell as a brand, and I think that results in just better recall, better engagement with the brand. It's no coincidence that Dell has renewed this program or a similar program like this already for 3 years in a row.
It's so interesting that ecosystem that's developing in podcasting. You know, traditionally you can hear your podcast anywhere. How do you think that that's going to change with the rise of Spotify and, you know, Amazon? What can we expect in that way, in the way that we connect with our listeners?
I think you're going to see that the majority of podcasts continue to be listened to in multiple platforms. So the RSS ecosystem, I do believe, is here to remain. And at the same time, you're going to see companies creating their own walled gardens. For instance, take out look at what we're doing at Wondery. We have our own app. We just launched in the UK a few weeks ago. And in that app, it's the place that is created specifically for Wondery shows. For instance, seasons of Business Wars, there are 42 of them. They're organized in a drop-down menu by season. That's a lot easier to listen to in that way than scrolling through 150 episodes. And you're going to see increasingly that the podcast ecosystem has more and more of these spaces. But I still believe that the vast majority of listeners, as I said at the beginning, will be done freely through multiple platforms.
Which is great for advertisers, right? You are going to reach a really wide variety just by buying in one space. And it's just really, really efficient. And I think especially with Wondery shows, the real benefit here is you can have a custom solution that means that your brand is not just being listened to, but speaks the language of that podcast, is creatively involved, because it's the producers that are making those calls and incorporating it, and the host as well, which is really incredible, right?
That's right, because you know that our brand is all about emotionally immersive storytelling. We want listeners to feel they're in the middle of the story. We take the same approach to the creation of our ads. Whenever there's an ad, and you guys in the UK hear ads, both producer-read and host-read, you can tell that the brand is, that the ad is written and is done in the voice of the show.
So tell us, what excites you about the UK podcast market? You know, what do you think when you look across? We've nearly been a year in business, can you believe it? But what excites you about this particular market?
One of the things that's really exciting is that we are in the UK, or you guys are in the UK, about to hit the same inflection point that I think we hit in the US 2 years ago. And 2018 was really a time of great growth in the podcast community here, where a lot of people who were podcast naysayers from the outside finally realized that podcasts were here to stay, and they were only going to increase in their reach and their popularity. And there was a point at which they turned from niche into mass medium. In the US, I think that's this year is the point where we're hitting 37% of listeners listening every month. In the UK, we're no more than a couple of years away. So it's really exciting. You're going to see more investment from brands, more creators who up until 5 years ago would have said, podcast not for me, and now are going to start entering the space and telling stories and creating their original shows. So you're going to see the same kind of momentum in the UK.
Hernan, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ruth. It's been a pleasure, and congratulations on an amazing year.
So, how do you ensure your brand takes advantage of this space? Well, who best to share with you our upcoming opportunities for 2021 than Ollie Walters, our Head of Sales at Podfront, and Helen Arnold, our Senior Account Manager.
There is a shared DNA and a mutual benefit between hosts and brands with our sponsorships. That connection is incredibly important to all of our podcasters when creating long-term relationships with brands. Wondery and Stitcher, as content creators and not just podcast networks, can offer flexible, creative custom solutions that feel aligned and integrated with brands' objectives. We provide 360-degree creative solutions that include bespoke editorial features, effectiveness tracking, and attribution measurement, all the way from a listen through to a click.
Ultra smart, ultra current, and ultra funny is a winning trifecta that attracts podcast listeners in huge numbers. At Podfront, we have dozens of shows perfect for the curious-minded, and we thought we should definitely take a little podcast moment with this particular host. It's Jonathan Van Ness.
Hi, IAB Podcast Upfronts. It's Jonathan Van Ness, the host of Getting Curious. Thank you so much for inviting me today. Getting Curious has been one of my just passion projects and biggest inspirations and proudest accomplishments of my career. It really started off as a place where I could chase down my unbridled curiosity and learn and kind of take this pressure off of like having to know everything. I've always been a curious person and I love learning. You know, and not to sound like Jennifer Aniston from The Morning Show, but I've literally interviewed like multiple senators, honey, mayors, doctors, these Oscar winners, Grammy nominees, at least, probably a Grammy winner. I don't know, but I mean, a lot of major people. And we have Brene Brown coming up. We have so many exciting episodes coming up. We've covered so much British topics like that I just have loved doing. So British sponsors, thank you so much for supporting Getting Curious. And just thank you for supporting the show. And I can't wait to keep creating and keep learning for all of you. So thank you so much. Cheerio!
If you want to escape this mad world for a while, then hang out with co-hosts Brooke and Arisha, who love talking about rich families and dynasties. They pull back the curtains and dish the dirt on someone else's craziness for a change. Brooke and Arisha tell the stories of some of the greatest family dynasties in history, from the Murdochs and the royal family to Jay-Z and Beyonce. Because none other than Queen Elizabeth once said, a good gossip is a wonderful tonic.
Connecting with Gen Z audiences is one of Adland's biggest current challenges. They're intensely sceptical, they dodge traditional advertising at every opportunity, and they can spot inauthentic content a mile off. If you want messaging aimed at this audience to land more like George the Poet's recent Coca-Cola ad and less like Kendall Jenner's disastrous Pepsi protest campaign, then you need a personal message from their favourite multi-hyphenate podcast host. From the organic success of her I Weigh Instagram movement, activist and actor Jamila Jamil's podcast is already one of our most listened shows. Here she is to tell you more.
We have truly found the greatest thinkers, writers, artists, voices, celebrities who can really give you the information you need to become a better person. And we believe in progress, not perfection. And I think that's why the podcast is doing so well at the moment, is that we're not lecturing you, we're not preaching at you. I'm learning and you're learning with me from these amazing people that I'm lucky to have the access to.
Have you ever wondered about history between some of your favourite business rivalries? In Business Wars, that is precisely what they aim to explain. Nike versus Adidas, eBay versus PayPal. Business is war. Sometimes it's the fun of beating the other guy. The outcome of these battles shapes what we buy and how we live. Listened to by nearly 4 million people monthly, Business Wars has recently been translated into multiple languages, including French, German, and Spanish. With its loyal listener base and affluent ABC One audience, this show has been a perfect fit for global custom integration with Dell and local national sponsorships with Indeed in Germany and Salesforce in France.
When the miniseries Dr. Death debuted in 2018, it reached #1 in the Apple Podcast chart in 10 countries. Since then, it's been downloaded over 50 million times and translated into 13 languages. And production has just begun on a big-budget TV adaptation. Host Laura Beale and the original team are back this autumn for season 2, which tells the true story of renowned oncologist Dr. Farid and his cancer clinic, celebrated for its world-class success rates. As more and more patients experienced complications, some started to question, was Dr. Farid's cancer diagnosis actually real to begin with? Meticulously researched and utterly chilling, Dr. Death Season 2 lands on October the 27th.
I mean, it's Oprah. What's not to love? Personal, powerful, and inspiring. All designed to light you up, guide you through life's big questions, and help you bring one step closer to your best self. Super Soul Conversations features guests such as David Letterman, Rihanna, Hugh Jackman, Tina Turner, and James Cameron, and connects well with families and decision makers in home shopping. There's an episode for any type of big or small life moment you might be going through. Don't just take my word for it.
Hello to everybody who is joining this virtual IAB podcast upfront. I don't have to tell you all, because you know firsthand that the podcast business has been exploding for a while. Everybody seems to have one these days, but I also know that millions of people all over the world love to listen and love to talk about their favorites, because podcasts have that ability to meet people right where they are in their daily lives and in such a unique and immersive experience. So when I started Super Soul Sundays almost a decade ago now, I wanted to share my favorite kind of conversations, that is spirituality, higher consciousness, with as many people as I could. And now over 300 million downloads later, actually 307,437,419, my hope is that these conversations inspire listeners to stay connected to what really matters and to live more consciously in the world. At the OWN Podcast Network, we are leaning in to those listeners. And this year, we have rolled out a podcast featuring the greatest lessons I learned over 25 years on the greatest teacher, The Oprah Winfrey Show. So soon we're going to be launching a new podcast of Eckhart Tolle's timeless teachings, one of my favorite spiritual teachers. Millions have already listened to our series with him on his seminal book, A New Earth. So I hope you stay tuned, because the OWN Podcast Network is looking ahead to create even more new content for our listeners. So I thank you to our partners for helping us bring these podcasts to the whole world. Bye, everybody, and hope you stay safe.
So there you have it. At Podfront UK, we have premium hit shows with incredible talent that provide brand-safe environments, perfect for sponsorship. We are delighted to announce Podfront's first ever partnership. This is a network famed for their engaging and thought-provoking podcasts that rival the BBC in terms of quality. Yep, you guessed it. We are delighted to welcome NPR, National Public Radio, to the network. This collection of shows increases our monthly reach by 21% and provides brands with an opportunity to buy against these popular and high-quality shows, such as Planet Money, How I Built This, Fresh Air, and TED Radio Hour. Incredible shows. Well, thank you all so much for your time today. This has been just a snapshot into our services, so please do get in touch if you'd like to find out more.
Boom, what a way to end. What a fantastic roundup of 6 sessions. Podcast tip, because I spotted it in one of the very first slides from Stitcher, Office Ladies. If you're a fan of the American Office, it's basically Angela and Pam from the show with a guest from every single episode, and they're just talking through each episode of the American Office. So if you love it, you'll absolutely love it, Office Ladies. Hernan, the Wonderly CEO, talking about how his route into podcasting, I'd imagine was like so many of ours, was through Serial. Definitely was mine. I mean, that was just absolutely brilliant. I remember when it was like trendy to do listening parties. I remember being in a room with loads of other people listening to this thing together, like this appointment of you. It was brilliant. And I thought it was really telling what he said about the UK having all of the momentum that he saw a couple of years ago in the US. So if you've watched these 6 upfronts and you haven't grasped that by now, that just hammers that point home. And to quote Oprah, who said that everyone seems to have one nowadays, well, the IAB have a podcast if you've not listened to it already. You just need to search for IAB UK wherever you get your podcasts from. Plug over. It was a brilliant, brilliant end from Podfront. We all need a bit of Jonathan Van Ness in our lives as well, I think. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. All that's really left for me to say now is to thank all of our partners who produced 6 amazing lots of 20 minutes hopefully for you to enjoy. So a massive thanks to Acast, Spotify, Audioboom, Bauer Media, Dax, and of course, you just saw them there, Podfront. But that's not where it finishes for us, because next week we go again with our standout upfronts. On Monday, you can hear from BBC Global News. On Tuesday, it's the turn of Twitter. Amazon Advertising are up next Wednesday. On Thursday, it's Snap. And to round off the week, it's Facebook. So I hope you'll join us then. All 6 sessions from today, all 3 sessions from yesterday's Gaming Upfront are all on the IAB UK YouTube channel. Just search for IAB UK. Thank you very, very much for joining us these past couple of days. I really hope we see you next week.